Jung. So I'll start by talking a little bit about synchronicity, just to put that in context. Synchronicity for Jung is on the one hand, the experience of meaningful coincidence between inner psychic and outer physical events. And he gives several examples of this. For example, the case of a patient of his who was telling him a dream about being given a scarab, a jewel in the form of a scarabaeid beetle, when an actual scarabaeid beetle appeared at his consulting room window. Then there's another example is the story of how Emanuel Swedenborg, in a visionary state, described the course of a fire hundreds of miles away in Stockholm, all the details of which were subsequently confirmed. And an anecdote told to Jung by a friend of his who dreamed of certain scenes and events unfolding in a Spanish city, which he'd never visited before, and that then occurred exactly as in the dream when the friend did visit the city shortly afterwards. So those are some of the examples of the kind of experience of meaningful coincidence. But Jung's concept of synchronicity also referred to the principle that he used to explain such experiences, which was a principle of acausal connection through meaning. And it's mainly that principle that I'll be exploring in its connections to poetry. And in order to do that, I've sort of broken down the concept of synchronicity into some of the sort of other ideas or concepts that are implied within it. And these are, first of all, the idea of acausality, and the idea that events can come into being or can be connected among one another without causal determination. The idea of the relativity of time and space, which is implied by the notion of acausality, that under certain conditions space and time can be relativized. And this relativization of space and time, which we saw in the examples of Swedenborg's vision, where he seemed to be able to see what was going on in Stockholm, even though it was hundreds of miles away, or Jung's friend who could see what was happening, even though it hadn't happened yet, it was in the future. This sort of spatio-temporal relativity can result in what Jung calls absolute knowledge, which is a kind of knowledge of spatially and temporally remote events without the need for sensory transmission of information. So it's knowledge that's not bound by ego or consciousness. So this is also implied by his concept of synchronicity. Also implied is the idea of objective meaning, by which Jung really means meaning that is, it's the idea that meaning is not something simply that is subjective and projected by us onto an in itself meaningless outer reality, but the idea that there is something beyond us, beyond the human psyche, or beyond conscious human psyche, there is really something there that we may interact with, and that is how we experience it as meaning, but it's not something simply that we are projecting onto an otherwise meaningless reality. And at the root of this for Jung is his concept of the archetype, which he what gives the meaning, or what underpins the meaning, is the idea of archetypes, which he saw as structuring factors of the collective unconscious psyche. And he characterized these as being universal, numinous, psychophysically indeterminate, or psychoid as he called them, and knowable only when they're expressed symbolically as archetypal images. So archetypes underpin this objective meaning. And the connection of events through synchronicity implies for Jung that the same pattern of meaning can express itself in both psychic and physical events. And in this sense, it reveals that at a deeper level, those events form a psychophysical unity. And this for Jung points also towards a sort of fundamental unity of being, which he elsewhere calls the unus mundus, or the one world. And the final implication I'd mention is the idea which really stems from the possibility of transcendental meaning and the unitary nature of reality revealing themselves in the empirical psychic and physical events of a synchronistic event. This, for Jung, suggests that synchronicity expresses, however momentarily, a harmony of transcendence and immanence. So those are the concepts that I'll be drawing on, and I think one can see that various ways in which they can help one to sort of attune to the resonances that exist between synchronicity and poetry. So in very general terms, acausality articulates the essential creative moment of poetry. In fact, one of Jung's pithier definitions of synchronicity was as creative acts in time, acts of creation in time. As for the notions of relativity of space and time and absolute knowledge that are implied in the notion of acausality for Jung, these are evident in the ability and license, indeed, of the poetic imagination to draw its material from any place or period and to articulate insights based on direct intuition. The notion of objective meaning, which for Jung, I suppose, is related to, well, is collective and is numinous, this aptly expresses the qualities of universality and emotional intensity that can attach to poetic insights. And meanwhile, the notion of the psychophysical unity through which objective meaning expresses itself is implied in various aspects of poetry. For example, in the attribution of animate qualities to inanimate objects, in the portrayal of emotions through what T.S. Eliot called the objective correlative, and also in the many subtle ways in which heterogeneous domains of form and content, or of sound and sense, can correspond to one another. And finally, the harmony between transcendence and immanence that represents, as it were, the deepest level of unity revealed by synchronicity. This has its parallel in the conception of poetry as a means of affirming and expressing the numinous, whilst remaining, as it were, grounded in quotidian realities. So those in a sort of an analytic kind of way are some of the ways in which the concept of synchronicity and the kind of knowledge, the kind of knowing and perceiving that is involved in poetry might connect. And I'd like to discuss them in relation to the poetry of Richard Berengarten, who's born in London in 1943. He's an internationally acclaimed and multiple award-winning poet, published over 25 books. He lives and works in Cambridge, where in the 1970s he founded and ran the International Cambridge Poetry Festival. And he has written and said in interviews that synchronicity motivates and underpins his own poetry, and has done for many years, and also informs his view of the task of contemporary poetry more generally. So he's very deeply interested in synchronicity. And just to give a couple of examples, his 2006 book, The Blue Butterfly, was inspired by a synchronistic event that happened to him when he was living and working in Serbia. And he's even written a paper on that synchronistic experience. And then a more recent book, Notness, a book of 100 metaphysical sonnets. This includes a section of 10 sonnets which are titled On Synchronicity and explore various aspects of the experience of synchronicity. But the work I want to look at today is a more recent book titled Changing, which is a single long poem comprising 450 shorter poems, each poem of those shorter poems being related to one of the hexagrams or lines of the ancient Chinese divinatory text, the I Ching. This book is the subject of a forthcoming volume of essays, a sort of kind of companion to the book, as it were, called The Book of Changing, and it's the talk I'm giving now is sort of based on something I wrote for that collection of essays. Within the book, Berengarten comments in a very interesting postscript about the connection between correlative thinking, the kind of thinking that underpins the I Ching, and poetry. He describes correlative thinking, associative thinking, as the mental foundation for poetry. And he also notes that it's the sort of basis of Jung's concept of synchronicity. So that kind of implies that he's also seeing synchronicity as, in a sense, part of the mental foundation for poetry. And it's that sort of hint, really, that I'm exploring here today. But what I want to do is to read some of the poems, and I've selected one of the clusters relating to one of the hexagrams of the I Ching, hexagram 48, which is normally titled The Well. In Berengarten's poem, it's titled Welling, Replenishing. And you can see here the titles of the 7 poems. The one that's italicized at the top there, Consultation of the Diagrams, refers to the hexagram as a whole, and then the following 6 refer to poems that are the poems that are relate to each of the individual lines of the poem. So I'm going to come out of this screen share and go into a different screen share, if it's still working. Let me just get this properly sorted. Oops. So, oops. Is that visible to, yeah?
We can see.
Yeah, good, you can see that, good. So I showed you this rather than type them into the PowerPoint, partly because it's very difficult to type poems into PowerPoints, I found, but also because so that you can actually see the typography of it, which is an interesting part of the poems themselves. I mean, the one on the left there is not part of this poem, but you can see that all of the poems in the long poem are in 6 sets. They're in 18 lines divided into 6 tercets. So it's kind of reflecting the structure of the I Ching as well, with its 6 lines and figures. So this one is number 48, Welling, Replenishing. So it's got a bit of calligraphy there. And if I go on to the poems, I'll read them out. It'll take about 5 minutes to read the whole 7 poems. And you'll see as I read, basically what the poems are doing. This might help to pick up more immediately on the imagery of them. There's a comparison being drawn between the I Ching, the book of changes, and the image of the well, which is one of the images of this particular hexagrams. Some of the poems are specifically about the I Ching, some of the poems are specifically about the well. And others of them, increasingly as the poem develops, sort of merge the 2 sets of images. So to start, Consultation of the Diagrams. Consultation of the diagrams is helpful in the construction of hypotheses, buildings and voyages, in the precise locating of wells, mines, bridges, towers, mirrors, in alleviating insomnia and fears of death, in the correct turning of antennae towards origins, and in all forms of measurement and modes of harmonizing. One, who drinks from an old well? Our well has dried up. Not even birds circle or settle here. Our clerks have been corrupted by one regime after another. Even lawyers and judges have sold out. Kept in pay of ministers and landlords, they collude in repression and persecution. Young and old alike abandon houses, pack bags, emigrate. Can we find a dowser with forked hazel or willow branch? Two, sometimes they answer. Sometimes they answer, even though I've asked no question. Sometimes they say nothing and appear to smile and look away. Or else they stare, like the dead, through me towards infallible sky. As quietly they pick out question behind question, before even any thought lurking under images and their nuances or timbres has arisen, let alone right words to articulate thought, have discovered me and opened. Three, from underground streams. We clambered down ladders and ropes. Workmates at the top let down shovels, sieves, buckets, poles, mallets. We dredged up a mountain of mud and waste fallen in and mulched down there over years. Hauled out rich, stinking vegetable stuff and rotten wood. Separated it from clay to fertilize fields. Hammered in new stepping brackets and handles as we relined walls. Deepened and widened entire cavity to hold more water pooled from underground streams than ever before. Four, I Ching. 50 years, my friend, companion, and spirit guide. Always trustworthy, never diffident, never irrelevant. Solid, yet flowing, firm, yet yielding, radiating images, self-replenishing, inexhaustible, fathomless, ever fresh well. In plumbing you, I soar, feet still grounded, rooted in this, here, now. Five, I lower my question. I lower my question on a rope of thought. I draw up water wisdom. It flows everywhere. I drink from a fund of deep light. Could wine be sweeter? If its taste is bitter, then I swallow it. Its bitterness is me. Is it sweet? Then I'm thankful. But keep aloof from drugs coiled in sweetness. These ways I come and go. Six, well inexhaustible. Self-replenishing and inexhaustible well. Generous secret, open face of underworld, with rounded mouth and level gaze, polished mirror and porthole of night, silvery cord and vertical pipe, invisibly joining heaven and earth's skin and core. beneath these eyes, in your reflection, on the sky's forehead, a star. So those are the sort of, that's a set of the poems, and what I'd like just briefly to do in maybe the remaining few minutes is just to, I mean, I hope that the poems kind of spoke for themselves in a way, and it's clear that to the extent that they are about the I Ching, and the I Ching is a system of thought that is sort of based on correlative thinking, synchronicity. It won't be surprising that there are some connections to synchronicity within this, I don't think. But I'd also like just to sort of draw out, using those sort of concepts implied in the notion of synchronicity that I mentioned before, just one or two sort of points. So, I mean, I suppose the first point I would make is that the overall association of the I Ching with the well, there was no specific sort of reason. I think that's an innovation of Berengarten's, certainly the extent to which he elaborates it is. So in a way that is part of his poetic creativity, I think, to have come up with that association. It doesn't sort of, it's not coming out of the text itself, it's not coming out of any well-known tradition, I don't think. But he sort of come upon that. But even more, I think the sort of acausality of synchronicity is evident in the sort of complex creative networks of meaning that emerge from the sort of imagery that's used. And I think that's, you know, particularly the case in for example, this final poem. I think one can see it, you know, the phrases, such phrases as rounded mouth and level gaze, polished mirror and porthole of night to describe the well. I mean, there's so much association clustered around that being brought in sort of acausally. You know, it's not things that are automatically linked with one another. So the rounded mouth suggests that the sort of comprehensiveness of the expressiveness of the I Ching. The level gaze suggests its imperturbable wisdom. The polished mirror is as well as describing, you know, literally the sort of effect of the still water at the bottom of the well, also creates a sense of, you know, a dark mirror, a sort of scrying mirror, suggests this idea of seeing through into some other reality. Similarly, the idea of a porthole of night, again beautifully descriptive of the circular well and the darkness, but also the idea of a porthole is through which you look from a sort of cabin confined position out into a sort of an oceanic vastness beyond. So again, it's got this idea of a transition into some other reality. So I think it's very sort of rich ways in which the imagery is constellated that and clustered. So, and then if you turn to the idea of sort of the implicit concept of the relativity of space and time, you know, if you can see certain terms that have been used, for example, in the poem 5 here, you know, the idea of the water wisdom that flows everywhere. It's kind of unrestrained by any place or whatever. And then in the second poem, the answers, the I Ching seems to know the answers before the questions have been asked. You know, so there's a sort of foretelling of the future. So the temporal domain has been transcended here as well. And then if we turn to the notion of absolute knowledge that Jung talked about, this sort of unconditioned knowledge, that's implied throughout the whole poem, really, by the very idea of divinatory knowledge. You know, that's there expressed in the very first poem, what he calls the head poem, this consultation of the diagrams. You know, that it can do all these express all this sort of knowledge, even more so in poem 4, where the knowledge that the I Ching delivers is always trustworthy, never irrelevant. So you have this idea expressed. Turning to the notion of the sort of objective meaning, I suppose this would be to some extent articulated by the idea of from the second poem of the understanding, which is sort of precedes or is deeper than any thought, any words, any images, or even sort of nuances and timbres of images. This sort of deeper level of understanding. It's expressed again, I think, in the fourth poem by the idea of the radiating images. You know, so there's an idea a bit like Jung's concept of the archetype, that there's something that radiates these images, some sort of core of meaning, and again, you know, in the fifth poem, I suppose, the water wisdom and so on. So you've got these ideas infiltrating or permeating the poem. The next sort of concept that I mentioned, the sort of psychophysical unity, the idea of there being expressed as sort of a unity between the mental and the physical domains, is interestingly expressed, I think, by the very idea of personifying the lines or the hexagrams in the poem. Something that's generally considered you know, an inanimate object, a book, lines, words in a book, and so on, are here treated as though they're actually alive and conscious and interacting and doing things very purposefully. So this personification, you get it in the fourth poem and again in the sixth poem as well, is sort of expresses that. Again, the phrase of, you know, the rope of thought. The rope is very concrete, physical. The thought very psychic idea, mental idea. So the two are sort of yoked together in this image of a rope of thought. Similarly with water wisdom, water very physical, wisdom very, very psychic. So you've got this sort of idea of a sort of psychophysical union. And I mean, there's not really the time to go into it in detail, but also the way in which the sound and the sense of the poems merge. The sound, the sense is the meaning, the psychic side of it, as it were. The sound and the sort of rhythm and form of the poems is, as it were, the sort of physical side of it, but it matches. And you can see, I don't know if you probably noticed when I was reading, some of the poems were just a single word, like this I Ching here, just one sentence, sorry, not one word, one sentence. Others of them, if we go back from Underground Streams, lots of, something like 7 or 8 sentences, about 10 major verbs and so on, proceeds much more slowly, reflecting what's being described, this sort of laborious work of digging out the well and fixing the well. So again, you've got this sort of conjunction, or this coming together of the psychic aspect and the physical aspect here, you know, as an intrinsic feature of the poetry. Then the final comment aspect that I mentioned, this sort of idea of a harmony of transcendence and immanence. I think this is expressed particularly well in this fourth poem, where at the end, in plumbing you, I saw. In going down, I rise up. In plumbing you, I saw, feet still grounded, rooted in this here now. So you've got the immanence emphasized precisely at the moment when the transcendence is being emphasized. And again, in the final poem, you get this as well. This idea of a kind of transcendence and a coming together of the high and the low, and that's most explicitly mentioned, I suppose, or conveyed. We've got all this invisible joining with the silvery cord and the vertical pipe, invisibly joining heavens and earth, the high and the low, the in and the out, the skin and the core, and so on. But you've also got the idea of the well and the star. The sort of well is the deepest, the sort of the darkness of and the deepest darkness that you can see, the deepest depth is the root of the well. But in that, you've got you can see the highest visible thing and most distant thing, a single star. So you've got this conjunction of the immanent and the transcendent. So I mean, these are just some of the aspects, and you know, it's quite analytic. There's a lot, endless more things one could say, but I hope that just gives a hint of some of the connections that one can find between poetry and the concept of synchronicity, and the usefulness of the concept of synchronicity as for analysing. Yes, of course, this poem, which is partly about synchronicity via the I Ching, but also poetry in general, that it's they're sort of operating in similar sort of cognitive and imaginative terrain. So I'll leave it there. Okay, thank you. I'll come out of my screen as well.
Thank you very much. That was a beautiful and very, very illuminating presentation. I mean, it's amazing how sometimes it feels like poets knew it all along. It's just that they have a different way of saying it, a different way of expressing it. But there's just so much parallelism between poetry and the ideas of synchronicity that Jung develops later on. We have questions. Sarah, do you see any questions in the chat box? I haven't opened it. Oh.
Yeah, there is a comment which I think could become a question.
Right.
When you talk about synchronicity, it sounds like the definition of the kairotic moment, coincidence of the moment with action and or poetic expression, from Leslie Gardner. If you wanted to say any more about that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. You know, kairos, the right moment, is very much a part of it. And I suppose poetry, writing poetry, those who write poetry will know that it's partly about there is a sort of timeliness and an aptness in finding the right word, the right expression, you know, for what it is that you're actually perceiving or experiencing in the moment. There is this sort of dimension of kairos about it, I think, hitting the mark. Yeah.
Definitely. And there's a question about, is this material published anywhere?
Which material? The poems or the essay? Anyway,
I would assume your essay or your work.
The essay will be part of the book that I mentioned, called the Book of Changing. It's a sort of companion to Richard Berengarten's sort of book Changing, which is, as you can see, I mean, you couldn't see on my slide, but it's actually quite a big fat book, as you'd imagine it would have to be if it was going to cover all the lines of the I Ching. So there's 450 poems in there. Yeah. So it will appear there. The editor will be Pascalis Nicolau and a couple of colleagues. I think it'll appear next year.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely keep an eye out for it. It's a lot of comments about what a wonderful and fascinating presentation that was, and it really was. This talk will be available after. Rula typically posts them on the YouTube channel. So
Psychreative YouTube channel. So all the sessions are recorded and will be available there.
Good.
I have a question / comments. Do you find any similarity between W.B. Yeats's idea of visionary poetry and the poetry that you presented tonight, Berengarten's poetry? Like the idea of the absolute reality, acausality, even the idea of a spirit guide, you know, in the I Ching and Berengarten's poems. So this idea that poetry is kind of the product or the language of the unus mundus, or the anima mundi, as Yeats called it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would personally think of poetry that way. you know, I think Richard Berengarten would be sympathetic to that view as well. Actually, you know, I don't like to speak for him, but he's very interested in these sort of areas of thought, and he's very interested in Jungian thought beyond just the concept of synchronicity as well. So. So yeah, I think his work is sort of informed. I mean, I see this poem myself, this is my judgment of it, as a kind of both a visionary poem. I think it is a sort of it presents a vision of a sort of an encompassing and holistic view of reality, and of a deeply interconnected view of reality, simply by the sort of diversity of poems. I mean, these are just, I read 7 out of 450. The subject matter covered is very diverse, and of course the way it's assembled according to the hexagrams and the hexagram lines, it's of epic length, but it's not an epic structure in the classic sort of way of all governed by a narrative. It's held together through this interesting, you know, the interesting structure provided by the I Ching itself. You know, so I see it as expressing a kind of vision, and also a vision partly of poetry as well, sort of an ars poetica, if you like, of the relationship between, you know, what poetry is and can do.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful. I mean, I personally wasn't familiar with the works of Berengarten, and I'm very interested right now. So thank you. Thank you so much for introducing us to it.
Okay.
And oh, there are more questions flooding in.
Yes, we have another question from one from Carol Mora. Would you say that perhaps the qualities of transcendence and immanence could be likened to the Apollonian and Dionysian? This connection causes me to wonder then if their confluence is where meaning arises, in the place between the idea or appearance and the felt sense within being. This line of thought brings to mind the differences between thought and perception.
That's a very excellent set of questions, and you know, I think there's a lot of, I mean, it would take a long time to tease out all the sort of implications of that, but I think broadly my answer would be yes. That, you know, I think there are you know, quite important connections. It's not, you know, I'm not sure you know, necessarily about, you know, the Apollonian, the Dionysian, and this sort of transcendent, and certainly those are two modes. Perhaps one could interpret it that way. One probably could interpret it that way, but it's yeah, it won't have to get quite into it. So it's a very, thank you for the question. It's a very sort of very rich and provoking question. Yeah.
Right. The rest are comments about what a lovely presentation.
Yeah.
And questions about the YouTube channel. We've already just posted the link in the chat box as well. So are there any other questions? We still have a few minutes. We still have 3 minutes, so we might as well take one more question.
And if anybody wants to just raise their hand, we can unmute you. Or have you unmute yourself.
This is Teresa Nowak. I didn't know how to raise my hand.
Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you. What a beautiful, inspiring way to start the weekend with this imagery. But my background is in-depth psychology as well. And one of the studies I work on is with people in their dreams and in their deepest fears. And I just wanted to say that in probably one of the scariest journeys I've ever done with somebody, in a very dark, horrific dream, I asked them to find a safe space to anchor, and they created the image of a well. It was very beautiful. That was their safe haven. It was this beautiful mound and a well, and his mother was nearby in his mind. And so this idea that the well not only is this archetypal source of that quenching your spiritual thirst, but it was holy ground, I guess is what I could say. And it was his lifeline. And then when you were sharing that imagery from the I Ching poem there, I was thinking of the golden thread, the unity of the below and the above, but also just sort of the cord that is attached in a well to the bucket that goes up and down. And that image came to me, but as really, truly a lifeline. And I just wanted to share that gentleman's experience because it was very profound and came to mind here when you were talking.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Thank you.
So I think the last two questions maybe in this section. There's one in the chat from Greg. Do you know how Berengarten got interested in Jung?
I don't know. It must have gone back a long way. I know he was interested in the I Ching. I mean, he says so in the fourth of the poems that I read out, or poem number 4 that I read out, where he said he's been his companion for 50 years. So he may have been interested in Jung from that period. I know that his wife is a Jungian analyst, Melanie Ryan. So that would explain or would help to reinforce his current interest in it, I would think. Yeah, so yeah, but it's long-standing. It's a long-standing interest. I myself met Richard first, actually, at an event in London that was launching Jung's Red Book in 2009. So it was a Jung event where I became acquainted with him.
Thank you. So Rosalie, you want to unmute yourself?
Wow, it was such a wonderful experience. And I live in Santa Fe, and my background is also PhD in clinical psychology with depth psychology emphasis. And I'm very interested in creativity. So I have a Jungian background too, but lately I'm focusing more on Winnicott for the creativity. But what I would like to say is that this is such a creative process here that's unfolding of your, first the explanation, all the amazing clear ideas that you put up there about the synchronicity, what synchronicity is, that it was so powerful for me that I start having insights, about my own place that I'm in right now. And I felt so appreciative with that. And I just would like to register that this is such a creative process that you're doing, that you did. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was, I recognize that too, just all the different layers that you brought into the presentation that connected everything together was really enlightening.
Absolutely. Yes, it was wonderful.
Runa, may I ask a question?
Sure.
So, first of all, thank you for your brilliant talk and for the moving reading of the poems. So my question has to do with the term archetype. No, you explained that it means something like original pattern in ancient Greek, no? And it seems to me that Jung used the concept of archetype in his theory of the human psyche. So each of us tends to have one dominant archetype that dominates our personality, So I was just wondering whether that archetype might be linked to the sensual, sensory origin of human animality. I mean, the rough and archaic primitive conditions of life, the land of magic. So I've one example in my mind, which is the one represented by the ingens Silva, described by an Italian thinker and philosopher, Giovan Battista Vico, and that has to do exactly with this topic. So, do you think that archetype has also to do with our sensory origin? Do you think it has to do with our animality, human animality?
Well, I mean, it's what Jung has to say about archetypes is very complex, and he developed the concept. But certainly one aspect of it, the ways he wrote about it was in biological terms, as something, as sort of patterns of behavior and patterns of ways of perceiving that built up from early, from the earliest times, as it were, through repeated experiences. One way in which he talked about it in a kind of biological evolutionary kind of way. He also talked about it in other ways, more sort of quasi-Platonic ways, that there are sort of forms that are sort of not necessarily exclusively in a physical sort of biological reality, as it were. So there's a sort of ambivalence and complexity in the way that he talks about archetypes. But certainly, when he talked about them, he talked about them in his later work as having an instinctual pole and a more spiritual pole. So the instinctual pole would very much sort of tally with the sorts of things that you're talking about. And his latest conception of the archetype as psychoid, so that it was a phenomenon that could structure not just psychic experience, but also physical events, and not just physical events in a physical organism, but physical events beyond an individual organism, so that it could, this is how synchronicities are accounted for by Jung in a way. The archetype expresses itself both intrapsychically and independently of that person's psychic out there in the world. So the archetype, is deeply embedded in material reality as well as in psychic reality. So it's in some sort of, somehow it's in both realities. It's as though it's in a reality that underlies both of the psychic and the physical. So it's a very complex notion and a very difficult notion to pin down for Jung, but it certainly encompasses the sorts of things I think you're talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very interesting question. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Rula.
Thank you. And now we move to some live poetry with Dr. Gottfried Heuer. Dr. Gottfried, are you ready? Oh, let me unmute. Yeah. Oh, yeah, you still need to unmute. Something happened. It was unmuted for a split second. Yes, now.
Yes, I start?
Yeah. Yes, you may, of course. The floor is yours.
Roderick, this is for you. You were one of the final examiners of my PhD on the anarchist psychoanalyst Otto Gross.
Yeah.
That exam was the first time ever in my life that an exam was a truly pleasurable experience. And years before, you also published the first reports of my research then, some 25 years ago, in the university newspaper, which you edited at the time.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Thank you ever so much for that.
No, thank you, Gottfried. It was, yeah.
Gross, 1877 to 1920, was the first psychoanalyst to link analysis with revolutionary change, for which at the time he was made an outcast of the psychoanalytic endeavor. Yet he had a strong influence on both Freud and Jung and many others. One of my colleagues wrote, 100 years ago, he created the psychoanalysis of the future. He was a man about whom a friend said, the other analysts stole from him to adorn their own posteriors. In turn, they exercised on him what the ancient Romans called damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. They tried to erase him from history. With my PhD, I intended to help correcting this. And after 9 international congresses, the 10th Congress was in Moscow in 2017, the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Gross, I imagine, would have enjoyed that. He died for everything in Russia went pear-shaped and worse. To tune in, I'll start with some words that are not mine, but come from A Course in Miracles. It is a little while that till timelessness comes quietly to take the place of time. And now to my poem. The Gathering of the Rebel Angels, with Otto Gross to Moscow, 1917, 2017, 2117. Past, present, future. Did you know that revolution actually means rolling back? Well, I didn't, and it somewhat disappointed me. Revolution, that longing for freedom, the desire for equality in mutuality, had been a favorite word of mine, a word that touched my heart and soul, came from my body and my mind, that longing. So let us roll then, let us rock and roll, go with the flow. That longing for equality, in fact, goes back at least 500 years, as the German peasants in revolt were challenging, when Adam dug and Eve she spun, who was then the gentleman, the nobleman? Let us roll back 100 years to 1917, to those 10 days that shook the world, when old had gone on far too long, and something, everything, just had to change, and it did. Longing for freedom, like a flower for the sun. A miracle has happened, the poet Alexander Bloch rejoiced. Nothing is forbidden. Almost anything might happen. Almost anything. Like Moscow, then in March, a liberty parade, hundreds of thousands in the streets. It was like a circle with a camel and an elephant plastered with posters like there won't be any freedom as long as woman is a slave. And from Eisenstein's film October, I see the woman on the drawbridge and her hair, that longing. In the parade, they also had a wagon carrying a coffin labeled the old order. Almost anything might happen, and it did. 1,200 miles to the west, as the black crow flies, as they say, a psychoanalyst, in fact, a psychoanarchist, for years had worked for exactly that, in preparation for the revolution that he was sure would come, and it did. He'd been longing for the freedom from the shackles of the mind. I have only mixed with anarchists, and I am one. From my experience as a psychoanalyst, I've gained the insight that the existing order is a bad one. And since I want all change, I am an anarchist. Longing. The longing, almost anything might happen, like the coming revolution is one for women's rights. And yet he knew all too well that so far all revolutions have run aground, have floundered, petered out, become just a renewal of the old that got repeated, because the revolutionaries of yesteryear did indeed roll back, reverted to the old power hierarchy, outmoded, they thought had buried, all because their souls had retained that old, in spite of their longing for freedom and the new. It's the psyche, our soul, individual and collective, so intimately linked as to be identical, that will need change for both the personal as well as the political, to transform for good, for the ever better, so that we don't roll back. Anything might happen. Miracles are possible. The mystery of healing can spread like the aurora, the rosy dawn of all-embracing love. My longing is, may every step I take be a step in that direction. Today, as we look back 100 years with open eyes to see, it is still true. We are many, they are few. Let's look ahead then, and as that longing is continuing to burn, more urgently than ever, let's make the change. Let's be the change we long for. Transform our souls inside out, and with it all the world about. Let us replace the will to power with the eros of relating. Let us replace the will to power with the eros of relating. That's my longing, my desire. Miracles are possible. Anything might happen now. Let's get there. Let's not wait another 100 years. Oh, my love, now I know all your freedom. I know that it will come. But what will it be like? Asked in 1863 Nikolai Chernyshevsky in his book, What is to be Done? And behold, a ladder set up upon the earth, and the top of it reaches to heaven. And behold, the angels of God. See, a white feather. There is one for each and every one.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Gottfried. That was very, very beautiful. And I also want to tell everyone that this poem will be published in the forthcoming issue of Indelible, which will be in exactly 1 month's time. So thank you so much for sharing this with us.
And I forgot to say thank you ever so much for inviting me. That's
You are most welcome. This is an
Thanks.
honor for us all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I believe we should go to the next speaker. So Dr. Gottfried, if you would like to leave your email in the chat box in case anyone would like to ask you a question regarding a poem.
Oh, sorry. How do I? I'm terribly sorry. How do I do it? I press chat box.
Yes. And then where it says two, do you see the two to everyone? I can type it for you.
Yes.
You want? Yeah.
Yeah, if you could be so kind.
Sure. Okay. So I will do the sharing. No worries.
Yeah. Thank you.
And next we have Kirstie Wackstaff, who will be presenting some of her beautiful artwork. So Kirstie,
Hi.
are you ready? Hi.
Yeah, I'm just sharing my screen. So this is where I hope it all works. Okay, there we go. So yeah, so I'm Kirstie. So I'm coming from a slightly different background because I'm an artist, not a Jungian scholar, but my work does focus on kind of dream imagery and also active imagination. And as I go through, I'm going to show you the images, and there is some poetry with it, but I don't class myself as a poet. So the poems are there to support the images, not kind of as poems on their own. So hopefully that makes sense. So the first one that we're going to start with is called The Descent, and the original image for this is on printed on silk. So it would hang and kind of move very, very gently. So you kind of need to have that in your mind as well. Okay. So I awoke that day, a surprise it was. I'd found myself in hell. Not one this time of Dante's making, but one all of my own. I turned and saw the gates were barred, all escape and options done, except to heed Churchill's wisest words, and if in hell, keep moving on. No Virgil had I by my side to keep me safe and sure, no casual witness was I here, the torment was real and raw. In hindsight now the gates were solid with their words of despair, yet these words I had not seen until my reflections led me there. The walls around were mighty, and no escape seemed possible, yet the mocking faces peered right in, and they wished to be invisible. I descended down the pit of hell and into Circle 2 arrived. The pain of loss was everywhere, in which tortured souls tried to survive. Tears of blood ran down their faces as birds pecked out their eyes and left them perpetually searching for what could never arise. Further I descended through this nightmare still to be, a few more steps and roundabout and on to Circle 3. Grief I felt and witnessed, plant-like bodies that I saw, buried half writhing and suffering to their core. Deeper on I travelled, as the pain and aches grew more. Sorrow became my friend again as I arrived in Circle 4. Here I witnessed loneliness, the empty and the meek, poor souls here strapped back to back and not a chance to speak. On I must continue, my tale still to tell, confronted now by anger in Circle 5 of hell. Forced to fight forever with others of their kind, great weighted stones between them, yet no winner could I find. The quiet of 6 hits me, silent screams were everywhere. Hope was gone, forgotten, all that was left was despair. The souls around here were lifeless, floating, pointless shapes, drowning now, not waving, pitiless mistakes. My journey turned a corner, the lower parts of hell, where all these forgotten souls, they clearly were not well. Circle 7 had 3 layers and shared a similar fate. The first who harm another, an aggression must they make, wrestling in water, in blood and tears too, heads above it gasping, their strength always to prove. Beside them with tears flowing, those that harm themselves, forever hacked to pieces, Prometheus's wounds exposed. Finally with them the suicides, those with pain too great, forever afire and burning inside of their own graves. Circle 8 appeared before me, 10 chasms did I see. The illnesses of the mind took hold, rocking souls in purgatory. The first to suffer in this realm were the afraid and phobic, followed by anxiety, depression, and neurotic. Panic then overcame the souls as further I descended, psychotic labels etched into skin, never to be mended. Hallucinated demons added greater fear for all, as if hell alone were not enough for those within its walls. And finally, the bottom, the lowest points of hell, the rotting corpses of defeated, the powerless as well. 3 rings I saw around here, as experienced as I went on, contorted heads all twisted, ashamed of what they'd become. Ring 1 for abandoned lovers and 2 for those betrayed. Ring 3 for those who trusted and now never will be saved. And so my journey seems over. Maybe I'm still lost in hell, yet it is my own and personal. With yours, I wish you well. So this next image is another one on silk, again, to allow for that kind of movement. And this is based on an active imagination that I did. So I'm going to talk through the imagination as well to explain the image a little bit. As we close our eyes in the attempt to sleep, the circling thoughts become persistent. The thoughts twist and turn, and the image of the carousel appears. At times, it moves so quickly it blurs everything in front of us. At others, it slows to almost standstill. The horses, once static, struggle to break free. They can see the fields and landscape, and like Pinocchio, they long to become real. As the carousel of unending thoughts moves quicker in our mind's eye, the background becomes one, and yet the horses emerge out of the darkness to grasp our attention. Some of these horses are not as strong, and only the briefest glimpse is available to us. Others are stronger in their desperation to be heard and seen, their mouths open in their silent screams as they try to break out of the wooden mould within which they are trapped. And as with our nightly insomniac thoughts, the carousel will continue to turn until the horses or thoughts are made flesh and given their freedom. So this one again is based on an active imagination, which I'll read through, and these are photograms that were created. So I looked at the sand and it was silver, absolutely silver and soft. I bent down and put my hands in it, and it was warm just under the surface. The spirit pointed and I looked, and there were footprints in the sand going away from me. The footprints were a young child's, and they were disappearing in the distance. I half followed and half arrived and saw a small child making sandcastles, but she was just filling up and emptying the bucket repeatedly. I said to the spirit, "She's alone. Is she always alone?" And he said, "Yes, because that's what she is. That's her story." And this is a series of digital photographs that, again, based on an imagination, active imagination, but again, in with the text of a poem to support them. Shh. It's quiet in here, inside this dream. The children sleep, but fitfully, unsure of what it means. Shh, she says again. If you listen carefully and place it by your ear, you can hear the sea. The youngest lifts it gently, looking older than her years. I can hear the turtle crying, she says. I think he's drowning in his tears. Another grasps it from her. All I hear is screaming. It's the silent scream of us all. Why would you want us listening? Shh. It's there, she says. You must hear past yourselves. Reach out across the worlds and you will hear the sea. Listen with your breathing and look out through blinded eyes. I promise you it's there, past this land of lies. One more shrugged her shoulders. I don't really want to know. I want to stay right here, she said, in the land where secrets dwell. Shh, she said. Step out yourself and open up your arms. You'll see the world surrounding us. Just hold it in your palms. The eldest child lifted it, turning it over to find its spell. I see no magic here, she said. It's only an empty old shell. Right, and that's it. Right. I will stop sharing.
That was absolutely amazing and very powerful. art and poetry. Thank you so much for sharing, Kirsty.
Thank you for having me as well. I'll have a look at the comments. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. And I'm sure there are lots of comments in the chat box. However, we only have 1 minute left for the 10-minute time slot, so I'm afraid we will need to move to the next speaker. However, Kirsty, if you don't mind sharing your email or your Twitter or any other contact info that you know, may let others be able to ask you the questions or give you their comments straight to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share my email because yeah, any comments would be lovely. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And okay, so our next speaker will be Aaron Mason, who will be sharing some of his poems with us. So Aaron, nice to have you here.
Thank you. So I have one poem, and as a way of introduction, I'd like to mention hearing an album by the Police when I was an adolescent. And the title of the album will become apparent. And now I'm an abolitionist and an anarchist. So the fact that the Police were one of my favorite bands as an adolescent is ironic. So here goes. This is called Sumning Gordon and Carl Gustav. Stay with me, stacking invisible bonds of togetherness and satisfaction, snugly sung. Yes is the magic I see in your connectivity, in yellowed wrinkles and spy novel yarns. Never leave. The yearning of silence would not nurture enough nesting wrens or nettles. Can you forgive my mistakes? The cacophony of half confessions and crepe paper ciphers? Hold me in mystery. Harvest tangential humor into grain, housed here in my heart. Revelers, come to the rained out carnival stage and fix your ribbled eyes on ripening. Oven baked goodness like mother's mother and my old man often offered and I overate. North of never, I will find you again, all who knew the me beneath the knowledge and me story. I will issue you children, though I did not intersect with procreation's ivy vines across time. City folks, we carry the weight of longed for countrysides and courtship from high-ceilinged cribs. If the clashes come to ire, let it mellow into intriguing connections with our skin inked in indigo. Take me now, tales of fate intertwisted, tripping through trails not taken, but felt to the tooth. You are the year who is many, the year who is one, and aged youths all, we yell for one more, yar. Thank you. And I will post it because it does have some visual, vertical, horizontal components.
Okay.
Let's see if I can share it.
Sure.
It's not letting. That's it. Let me try one more time.
Yeah. Give it time.
I might be able to attach it.
Okay. Yeah, that could work.
Ah, there we go.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Can everybody see?
Uh-huh.
Oops. That's not what I want.
Oh. But at least the screen sharing is working, so there you go.
All right. Thank you all. Are there time for questions? Or?
Thank you. Yes, of course. You still have 6.5 minutes left, so we can take questions. Thank you so much for the beautiful poetry, Aaron.
Thank you all.
And let's check the chat box. We have a comment from Carol Mora. Gorgeous imagery and deep sense of lyric. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if anyone else would like to use the mic, feel free to do so. Linda Marshall says that was beautiful, Aaron. Sure was.
Thank you.
Just to say thank you very, very much, Aaron. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I
Thanks.
appreciated your poem too.
Thank you.
So, anybody else would like to ask a question or give Aaron a comment?
The album I was referring to, by the way, is called Synchronicity.
Okay.
By
Oh,
the Police. And the first letter of each line vertically spells the word synchronicity.
Synchronicity.
I love wordplay. I used to be a copywriter, so.
Oh. Yeah, that explains it. Yeah. Okay, so again, thank you, Aaron, so much.
Thank
and
you.
we will move to Karla Van Vliet, who will be sharing some interesting dream work. Is it?
Well, it's actually some ecemic paintings or ecemic writing. You can hear me, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I just want to give, I'm going to give like a few, these are some of the pieces I'm talking about. Ecemic writing is kind of an up and coming art form that utilizes sort of the gesture of writing towards expression of, and of course everyone has their own voice or their own kind of way of writing or using that gesture within their pieces. I am a dream worker. I'm also a poet and also an artist, but there were times, especially during the last 4 years, when it was very difficult to find voice. And yeah, I didn't want to lose my practice of being in touch with my own desire to create and express and become silenced in that inability to express what I needed to say and wasn't yet ready to speak. So I just published this book called Fluency, and it's a collection of ecemic writing and also an essay that speaks to ecemic writing, creativity, and my own experience. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from this book, and I think I figured out how to share a screen image. So let me try this. Okay. And there we go. So that just sort of set the tone for the piece. The first part of the essay introduced the reader to ecemic writing, but also to the river where I often go to find solace. So, but there are times when I do not have words, yet I have the need and desire to write. It is to ecemic writing that I turn in these moments, to the gesture of writing. Here I find the mark carries the feeling state that cannot be or cannot yet be put into poem. It keeps me in practice, the practice of paying attention to what is often the uncomfortable state of allowing the feelings within to be experienced. Our culture doesn't generally support this, with so many ways of distracting ourselves at the tip of our fingers, and yet we die of it every day. For without experiencing who we are and how we are in relationship to the world, we walk around separate from ourselves. What is the point of being alive when we are dead to the experience of being alive? And so I come to the river on a cold, snowy day, or in the heat of summer, metaphorically or literally. I come to the state of being that the river holds for me, a kind of silence and stillness that is full of sound, the water rushing by, the birds' calls, the sound of children playing at times, far off traffic, trees rubbing their branches, and always the hum of insects. All this like the busy mind set aside. I listen into this empty and full space, and then I place my pen or brush to the page and let my hand move. This is the practice of communicating with what is within me. With ecemic writing, I do not need to know anything more than this. No word required, no sense of meaning required, just the willingness and desire to be in the process of making marks. I look back at what I have written, and although I know the truth in it, it is not the whole story. The river is that place in me, that sense of peaceful meditative attunement. It sounds good, a kind of perfection of nature and spiritual sensitivity. And that is genuine. That agitation that wells up in me is most often settled by a visit to the oxbow. All that true, but not the full story. Good, happy, at peace is not always the true place of our feeling, or even the necessary place to dwell and experience in our feeling selves. We are full of so many feeling states which are true and important, informative to the essence of our experience. Anger, grief, joy, passion are just a few of them, and rarely are they pure states of feeling. Anger is marbled with grief, joy with passion, passion with grief. You get my drift. Still, these states of experiential sensation, as uncomfortable as they can be, are worthy, just as worthy as peacefulness, contentedness. Kali, goddess of destruction in the Hindu faith, is associated with liberation and creation. And the phoenix of Greek mythology must burn to ash to regenerate and be born again. These places also arise wordless and in need of gesture. Let the hand move, let my hand move, let it move in the burning sensation of fire, of desolation, of crippling loneliness, in the bird flight or song of joy, in the mountain stream water or the constant crash of ocean waves. I dream the image of ecemic writing over a moon, a variety of depictions of this image over and over again. This is the whole dream. I know I should paint this image to engage in it and to see what it will bring. I make a quick sketch of the image when I wake. I am, after all, someone who pays attention to my dreams, and I write my dream down whenever I wake with one. It takes me weeks to overcome my resistance to painting the image. I chose to make a large painting to match the dream, and when I finally have the canvas prepared, I stand before it. This big canvas, a white field, is like the snow-covered vistas that are the landscape of Vermont in winter. In its negative, it is the cloud-covered night sky, dark and wide and empty. What mark will illuminate? I stand before the unknown, the empty, blank, bare plain of possibilities. This place can be overwhelming, anything could happen here. And then the first mark, the first field of color covers the canvas. I find my way. I begin to feel the power of the image and of my body expressing the image. I stand facing into a kind of fear, the fear of standing in the light of expressing what is coming through me. Such a large painting, large expression to bring into the world. It's uncomfortable. I recognize this feeling. When I start on a new piece that's calling to be painted, I often feel the power of as resistance. I know I'm onto something good when this happens, and I often hate the piece, have to reason myself as to why I am following the call to paint it. Having engaged in this moment many times, I recognize the pattern and I don't let it stop me. Why the moon, I ask myself. Michael Meade speaks of this old idea of lunar knowledge, relates it to embodied knowledge, knowing things by heart. Meade says, as poets used to say, ideas live in the blood. This is a different source of knowing, not that which comes in the constant presence of the sun's light, but in the ever-changing light of the moon. The moon's light, like the knowing of the body always in flux, feelings moving through us. The moon, like the dream, showing us light in the darkness. I follow this light. I cannot tell you more about what or why it is important to start making these paintings, the large moon painting or these smaller day pages, but I can feel within me some shift towards standing with myself. Do I need to know more than that? I want to tell you it's about this or that, but I don't know yet, and I may never know beyond what I've already said. I follow. It may be that to follow is the very meaning, and I'm okay with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karla. What a very beautiful way of communicating with what is within you. And you just have the perfect voice when you're reading. I mean, it's so meditative.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you so much for sharing this. And
thank you
if
for
you could also share your email or your website so that, you know, people might want to know more about your work.
Sure,
So,
sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Karla. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time to answer questions now, but you may want to check the chat box for any comments, or if you would want to address some of the questions directly to the people who are asking them.
Sure.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we move to Dr. Hedy Habra.
Hi, Rula.
Hello, Hedy. Hi. Hedy will be sharing some beautiful poetry with us again tonight.
Okay, so I will be screen sharing and reading poems, ekphrastic poetry and regular, traditional poetry. I'm looking for the share screen. Okay, let's hope it works. No?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll first read from my book, Tea in Heliopolis. This poem is titled Missing Words. We both stared at the illuminated images of what must have been a rare book. Its pages seemed to turn on their own one by one, following the rhythm of our breath. Were we so afraid to touch its precious leaves? I noticed faded characters here and there, like distant memories. Missing lines rubbed away by fingers or written in invisible ink. Perhaps words never said, unable to fall in proper order. Could the writer or scribe have wished to light a match, imagined its fire racing along the elongated curve of the phrase, erasing even the traces of his thoughts? Then came an empty page, papyrus-like, arresting, intimidating the one about to stamp it with the colors of life. Whatever happened to this page, I wondered, realizing you were gone. The next poem is about one of the numerous encounters I have on my backyard, where we have a beautiful creek. It's titled The Bullfrog. Like a Mandarin staring at his silky reflection, a narcissus frog seated on an arrowhead leaf thinks he's a yellow flower. I watch him, my own split image, schizophrenic frog, conscious of the other in himself. And the next poem is titled How the Song Turns into a Legend. We all have but one song, spend a lifetime looking for ways to say it. As one recites an unending poem, a chanson de geste, a canto, or an epic, what happens then if you whisper it only to yourself, burying it deeper every day? Wouldn't it wilt as petals pressed between the pages of a book? And couldn't a garden die of indifference? But take any couple, an encounter, turn it into a legend, make it last. Their story told and retold, ritualized by repetition, until their stature grows, their eyes brighten, until their voice is heard, their sin forgiven. Recount tales in tongues, in parables, uttered in public squares, whispered in corners, in sotto voce, from mouth to mouth. Hear a mother's voice warn her children with a half smile. Witness puppets parody star-crossed lovers in street fairs, in jest, in awe, in ever-changing roles and settings. Watch words form lines, notes, scripts, scores written in scrolls, in parchment, in manuscripts folded in folio, in quarto, scribbled in notebooks, in recipe books, in brown paper, engraved in stone, in bronze, gold, or ivory, transcribed, transformed, until only names are left untouched. When so many variations deafen the original song, then and only then the images retain their spell, become universal, art legitimizing what could never endure. I will next read an ekphrastic poem from my ekphrastic collection titled Under Brushstroke. This poem is titled Origin, and it's from the point of view of a grain of sand. And it's inspired by an abstract painting. When I wrote it, I had no idea who the artist was nor the title of the poem. So that I found out that it's totally different from writing a poem inspired by an artwork that we've admired for a long time or whose artist we know. So here is the poem. Origin. I have no name, no face, no age. I have lost track of my birthplace, a grain of sand blown by the slightest breeze. I've crossed continents and shores, flown over dunes and quarries, known the brush of leaves and grass, even rested in ponds after being swept by crested tides, always unseen, but never lonely, my edges smooth by rubbing against ruby, garnet, coral, quartz, shells, endlessly smoothing each other's skin, surviving the heat of scorching sun, drowning in carmine sea, until that last sacrifice on the pyre, where our blood melts into layers and layers of crimson petals opening up in their last frozen gesture. Is anyone aware that I am forever prisoner in that translucent flower? And the last poem I'll read is inspired by this artwork, surrealistic art by Remedios Varo, Spanish-Mexican artist, whom I greatly admire, and I've written numerous poems and still write inspired by her art. So I'd like you to take a look a little bit at the painting before I read the poem. It is part of the new collection I'm finishing right now of ekphrastic poetry, but all inspired by women artists. So the poem is titled, "Or How Could We Ever Win the Heart of Any Woman?" Or how could he ever win the heart of any woman? She shuffled seasons at will, carpeted her floors with grass and wild flowers, picked the first man who showed her a spark of kindness, and carved his heart in her own image. Words danced in vibrant hues over the pages of her diary, giving life to a silhouette, hovering in half tones in midst of the grisaille. With an empty stare, she'd sit for hours, see his shadow kneel in front of her, listen to his fading merman's song. She'd redress his crossed eyes, bent shoulders, and slight limp, or else how could he ever win the heart of any woman? She thought of Beauty and the Beast, although he was no beast and she was no beauty, until the day she flung windows wide open, let gusts invade the rooms, let her skin bear the colors of dead leaves, and knew time had come to pull the thread, unravel the feelings spun around his heart. Thank you.
Such gorgeous poetry, Hedy, as usual, and as
Thank you.
so many people around the world know about your poems. Thank you so much. It's always a great pleasure and honor having you with us. And again, Hedy, if you would like to share your email or your website, Facebook page, Twitter account, feel free to do so in the chat box. So thank you all so much for being here. And it's always wonderful to hear all the amazing poetry, artwork of all kinds from everyone from so many different places around the world. Next time, we'll be on the 12th of June, same time. And the opening talk will be given by Dr. Gottfried Heuer, who shared with us his beautiful poem tonight. And if you would like to submit anything, if you would like to be part of the presentations after the opening talk, please drop me an email. And you know, we could book you in for the presentation. Also, it's not a Psychreative per se session, but there's another session coming up next week for Indelible. And this session will be hosting Jasper Ford and Leigh Perry and Josh Pachter, who are all writers of mystery, crime novels, fantasy. So if any of you are fans of any of those authors, again, feel free to tune in. I will leave the information here in the chat box, my information. So you could feel free to email me at rithamaria@hotmail.com for more information on Zoom links and anything else that is related to our forthcoming events. We also have a Psychreative channel. So just type in Psychreative in Facebook or YouTube, and then you could also get the chance to see photos or videos of our sessions. So until we meet again, everybody stay safe, take care, and thank you all for being here. Sarah, thank you so much for the wonderful co-hosting, and thank you to all the presenters.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, everyone.
Have a good day. Sorry, most of you are in the morning zone. Right. Bye-bye.
Right.